Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sofia Vallila Rohter. Dr. Vallila Rohter is an associate professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders and co-director of the Cognitive Neuroscience Group at the MGH Institute of Health Professions. She holds a BA in Romance Languages from UNC Chapel Hill, an MS in Linguistics from Georgetown, and a PhD in Speech, Hearing, and Biosciences and Technology from MIT. Dr. Vallila Rohter's research focuses on understanding how people with aphasia can relearn language skills. By using behavioral and neurophysiological models, she investigates the role of non-linguistic cognitive systems in therapy success and aims to help clinicians personalize treatments. Today, Dr. Vallila Rohter will present recent work from her lab that examines how different instructional approaches, such as errorful versus errorless learning and observational versus rule-based learning, affect rehabilitation outcomes. And she will also discuss findings on feedback processing and share results from a pilot study that integrated metacognitive strategy training to enhance understanding and promote generalization in therapy for people with aphasia. So very exciting work, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Vallila Rohter.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. It's fun to present the work here where it all started. So Sofia was my PhD mentor who kicked all of this off. So I'm presenting work that has taken off in many different directions since I was here. So big picture, let's see if this works. Yeah. So the big picture problem, and this remains the big picture problem, I think I've had this slide for a decade now, is that our outcomes lack predictability. So in aphasia, we know that treatment is not yet individualized and the mechanisms of therapy aren't fully understood. So what that means is we can have two patients who, based on the assessment panel that we give them, are going to have comparable diagnoses. But then when we enroll them in therapy, they'll receive therapy. And it's very typical for us to have one patient who might respond to a treatment or intervention, and then have another patient who has a different response and does not respond to treatment. And there are still many ways in which we aren't able to predict that differential response. And so the area where I am interested in focusing in is this idea that the process of rehabilitation itself is a learning event. So when we enroll people in therapy, we are going to test them. We're going to use standardized assessments to get a sense of the strength and weakness of their language system. We're going to think about who they are as a person and what their goals are. So thinking about the participation, the personal aspect, what they want to get back to. And then we're going to schedule them. So we're going to schedule them for sessions. We're going to see them repeatedly, and we're going to work with them in therapy. And we're going to repeat that therapy on a regular schedule. That therapy might work on something like naming. It might work on something like AAC or script training. And ultimately, our hope is that this is all going to generalize to them, improving their functional communication in a real world experience. So big picture, the language profile and the functional goals are going to determine the targets of that intervention, but learning is carrying patients to achieve these. When we look at this process of seeing them repeatedly, working on strategies, working on improving lexical retrieval or a device, that's the learning piece. And that's what I've been interested in for a long time. And learning has been looked at across a variety of populations. Most of the theoretical knowledge that we have comes from research in people with Parkinson's disease and amnesia. So amnesia in particular, we know it's really defined by a deficit in memory. And so through that, we've come to understand that sometimes a change in instruction method is really critical for successful learning. So when the material is kept the same, you can manipulate the stimuli, you can manipulate the context, you can manipulate the feedback, and that can actually unlock learning potential in someone who previously could not learn. And this is what really gave us an understanding that there were multiple memory systems for learning. There are different ways to achieve the same outcome. And these memory systems are really thought to interact or compete throughout learning in a non-brain damaged individual. And we're working with people who have damage to some aspect of their brain, and there's likely a deficit potentially in these memory systems as well. But most importantly, within our therapies and in our learning tasks, there are certain conditions that can emphasize the engagement of one system or another. People likely have preferences, and we can talk about that. So they might not take the most optimal route, but we can actually manipulate our tasks to try to engage one system or another. There's a great paper that Claudia Peñalosa, who did a postdoc in this lab, recently published that is a review of studies on language learning in aphasia. So I just put the title of that paper. I'm not going to talk about language learning, but she put together this work that is a really great overview of the work that's been done so far and how novel learning does potentially have an impact or have a parallel with what we see in reaccess or functional reorganization or reuse of language in aphasia. But big picture, stroke is likely affecting mechanisms of learning. And so our big picture questions are, could changes in instruction method be critical for certain people with aphasia? How do we understand that? How do we begin to think about aligning therapy to the individual? So the first study that I'll talk to you about was really driven by Kristen Nunn, who was a recent graduate of my lab, and we carried it out in collaboration with Erica Middleton. And this is a scoping review. And it was a scoping review looking at errorless, errorful, and retrieval practice for naming treatment in aphasia, because this is an area in the aphasia treatment world where people have manipulated method of instruction to see, does that have an impact at the group level? Does it have an impact at the individual level? So this again was a scoping review. We didn't do any of the original studies ourselves, but in this review, we also decided to apply the rehab treatment specification system, which I suspect many people are aware of, the RTSS. It's a really great specification system that encourages us to think about the mechanism of action. So what is the mechanism underlying our interventions? The active ingredients, what is the clinician doing? What are they manipulating in therapy? And the targets, what are we trying to change? What is the target of the intervention? And so within our scoping review, we wanted to look at the literature and see, okay, if we look back to these studies carried out before there was the RTSS, do we see a described mechanism of action for errorless, errorful, and retrieval practice approaches, outline the treatment ingredients, and then consider treatment ingredients in the context of comparative effectiveness studies. So we looked only at studies that looked at the comparative effectiveness between either errorless and errorful, errorless and retrieval practice, or errorful and retrieval practice. So they had to look at two of these interventions side by side. So if we're thinking about errorless learning, this might look like something like this, where there's a target. And so the target is there, and in an errorless context, the clinician is going to say apple, so that the patient can then say apple. The goal being that you want to prioritize accurate naming. And this comes from these Hebbian mechanisms of learning that you want to reinforce the correct stimulus and response association. And by reinforcing that correct stimulus response association, you will kind of ensure that that's going to arise later on independently. In terms of errorful learning, it's very similar, but in an errorful learning context, we would see a target, and this time the clinician would say, what is this? And this time the patient might get something wrong. Pair attempts to name the target. They are not necessarily encouraged to be accurate in their productions. This is modeled from a mechanistic perspective as a gated Hebbian learning system. And this is work by Lembo Ralph. They've made and Fillingham, who published this model in 2007. So they describe this still as Hebbian, stimulus response association, but it's gated. What is it gated by? You have to first detect that an error was produced. You have to have memory and coding of the correct response. And then it also requires these attentional executive skills. Should I make myself smaller? It's fine. Attention and executive skills to then support that error correction. So without that gating, this is where errorless approaches were leveraged in certain clinical populations, because if any of these is damaged or not intact, we're going to reinforce the incorrect stimulus response association. Now, retrieval practice is kind of a combination of the two. Retrieval practice would involve a familiarization trial that looks a lot like errorless learning, where you familiarize. So in this case, the clinician would say apple, and have the client say apple. And then later on in the same session, they would present the target and say, what is this? So it's interesting in that it kind of combines both of the components of errorless and errorful. And it does this with an aim to balance success and effort. And a lot of the work in retrieval practice is looking at memories and storage strength, with the idea that when memories are kind of diminishing, when you retrieve them with effort, that maximal effort, if successful, is best encoded and retained long term. If it's not successful, it's not going to be encoded and retained. So you really have to balance the success and effort in retrieval practice. Now, when we looked at the way that treatment studies manipulated these ingredients, and this was within the context of anomia rehabilitation for aphasia, cues are one way, right? So you could provide cues, phonemic or semantic, verbal or orthographic, and you can do this in descending or ascending hierarchies. So you add cues to provide more scaffolding, or you take them away to provide less scaffolding. Many studies differ in terms of the way that they gave feedback after a response. In some cases, feedback can be implicit. What does it mean to have implicit feedback? You go on and on and on and on until you get it right, and then you move to a new target. That's implicit. Explicit feedback is really showing you that's correct or incorrect. Corrective versus informative, something where you just say that's correct or that's incorrect, is corrective. Informative would be saying that's not right, that's going to be corrective and informative. And then studies really differ in terms of their intensity and schedule. So a number of sessions per week, weeks of therapy, number of attempts, number of items trained, and the schedule. So what we did is we looked at all of these studies and we looked at the comparative effectiveness, and we tried to extract, okay, what do all of these show us in terms of what is most important to promote? The first thing that comes out is that success and effort are important to promote gains. Makes sense, right? So you have to get it right, but this effort comes out. How do people promote success and effort? Through cues. So with these descending and ascending hierarchies. And then where Erica Middleton has done a lot of work is in the schedule of the repetition of items. So interestingly, you can make something a little bit harder, but still successful if you, for example, have a successful trial and then only 2 items later, you repeat that item, versus when you increase in complexity, you have 5 items that separate it before you repeat it. Interestingly, and not surprisingly, language profile also plays a role. So this is a schematic of Dell's model, which we're all familiar with, but the idea being that there are different levels in our linguistic processing. We have this level of semantics and semantic feature activation. And then we have the level of the phonology or the sounds that make up a word. And through Erica Middleton's work in particular, she's found that repetition-based treatments, so errorless treatments where you're repeating the target, are really helpful at stimulating word phoneme mapping. Makes sense. Most effective for people who are producing phonemic errors when they're retrieving targets. In contrast, when people are making semantic paraphasias or errors that are semantic in nature, they have to have that deeper level of practice. They need that retrieval practice to stimulate that semantic word mapping and improve. So we see that success and effort are important to promote gains, and that the error patterns in language production were important for predicting potentially what type of intervention might be beneficial for people. And we also saw that feedback might be critical. So particularly in the case where, as we know, people with aphasia might have reduced insight into their own errors, it's really important to have that externally provided feedback so they don't rely on internal error detection. And that's going to be something we'll pick up again in a minute. So Kristen wrote a really interesting accompanying paper to the scoping review, where we looked at the literature and we wanted to provide something that gave a summary of evidence-based kind of hints or strategies for clinicians to implement to promote some of these strategies. So in terms of promoting effort and success, I already kind of mentioned this, but you can actually leverage spacing to increase the level of effort or decrease the level of effort. And spacing can be manipulated within a treatment session or across treatment sessions. So you can balance this effort and success by having fewer or more intervening trials. You can also leverage cues. So increased or decreased cues can kind of be balanced to have an individual person reach their appropriate level of effort and success. You can gradually increase effort. So for people who are really severe, maybe they have to have errorless techniques initially, but thinking about clinicians not being locked into that and thinking about gradually graduating the patient towards more difficult but achievable contexts. And then thinking about speed accuracy trade-off or building awareness. So there's a way to help people calibrate and have effort, kind of recognize when they can't retrieve a term and kind of request a cue versus internally go for that effort if they feel like they're going to be successful. And I mention that because something that we are dreaming up or would love to be able to offer our clinicians is some kind of decision-making tree for something like naming intervention. And this is what I mean by thinking about aligning learning approach with clinical intervention. So this would show us that at the beginning, it's really their language. Does somebody show a deficit at more of the phonological level or the semantic level? But then once you determine what type of intervention they might benefit from, some people might benefit from spacing. Some people might need metacognitive strategies. Some people might need improved feedback processing. There are also some psychological needs that we can manipulate. So in the future, we're building out on some of these, but I'm going to talk to you about feedback processing. So feedback processing is another area that we've been exploring, particularly with the collaborative support of my colleague Yael Arbel, who does a lot of feedback processing work in kids with developmental language disorder. And Kristen Nunn and Victoria Tilden-Blowski worked on this project quite a bit. So this project was looking at only controls. So here we're looking at a group of young adults and a group of older adults. You can see this is pilot work for who we would have eventually as our stroke population, right? So this would be the control group for our eventual stroke work. So in this study, we had everybody do a novel abstract category learning task. People we were chatting with before, this was the task for my dissertation, slightly manipulated, but a novel abstract category learning task that I'll walk you through. And importantly, though, we had everybody complete 2 versions of the task. One was under a condition of immediate feedback within 500 milliseconds of making their response. And the other condition was a condition of delayed feedback where they got feedback 6 seconds after making a response. And while they were doing these learning tasks, we counterbalanced the order as well as the stimulus set, but everybody completed both tasks. And we did it while they were wearing an EEG cap. So we're looking at their EEG signal, specifically looking at their response to errors. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So here's what it looked like. Here's the immediate feedback condition. So they would see an animal and they know at first that they're guessing. They have no idea to which category this animal belongs. We have a little script. We say these animals live either in the cave or in the forest. Make your best guess. They make a guess. And then in the immediate feedback, 500 milliseconds after their guess, they get this feedback response. The delayed feedback condition looks exactly the same. They see a different set of animals, however. This one's still the same set of animals. They make a response. And then this time, they then get feedback. Feels really different, right? Mm-hmm. So a small manipulation, but if you were with me there, feels really different. And so we were able to compare behavioral accuracy on these 2 tasks, as well as look at the processing of the feedback. And as I mentioned, we actually had 2 different stimulus sets. So each time they're learning to categorize a new set of animals, and we counterbalanced which one was first and which animal set went with which task. So here's what we got. So remember, we have young adults and older adults. The dark bars are going to be the immediate feedback condition, and the light bar is the delayed feedback condition. And here we're looking at a mean slope score. A slope of 10 is ideal learning. So big picture, what we see is young adults can learn equally well and successfully under both conditions. And you see that the older adults have lower scores under condition of immediate feedback relative to delayed feedback. So just that 6-second delay helped the older adults look like and learn as successfully as the young adults. This is one of these small task manipulations that can unlock that learning potential. Now, what we were looking at was looking at ERPs to elucidate feedback processing. So we were looking specifically at the feedback-related negativity. So this is an event-related potential. So what that means is that we time-locked this to the presentation of feedback. So when they saw either X's or checks, that was our event. And the feedback related negativity is a negative going wave. So negative is always plotted upwards. It's a negative going wave that you expect to see about 250 to 300 milliseconds after the presentation of feedback. And it's thought to capture feedback processing within this frontostriatal circuit. So it's kind of this reward prediction error that is elicited in the instance of feedback. And a typical response is larger to negative feedback than it is to positive feedback. So the solid line, oops, sorry, my mouse isn't working very well. Red is negative and blue is positive. And when you see a difference, that's the expected response, because people are actually using negative feedback more to then inform learning and their subsequent responses. We also wanted to look at the N170, which is an earlier wave, which is most frequently associated with face perception, but it's also been proposed as a possible indicator of MTL involvement, so medial temporal lobe. And those of you who think medial temporal lobe versus reward mediated, we're somewhat mapping on kind of implicit networks versus explicit declarative networks. And interestingly, MTL activity is most typically observed when there's a delay between the event and feedback. You're maybe more explicitly encoding that feedback into memory as you process it. So if we look at the young adult data, remember these young adults learned equally well under immediate and delayed feedback. And here I'm specifically looking at the FRN. So this is a centrally picked up ERP component. And what I've emphasized here is that we see the expected signature. We see a typical FRN for immediate feedback, where we see this very large response for the negative feedback, which is in red in this case, and a smaller response for the positive feedback, which is the solid green line. Now, when the feedback was delayed, which is represented by the dotted lines, there's no FRN. Makes sense. The FRN is not elicited in the condition of delayed feedback, but you see a really nice FRN in the condition of immediate feedback. Whereas our behavioral results are equivalent for immediate and delayed feedback. So what's going on? During the delayed feedback, what we see, here I'm showing P7, which is where we pick up the N170. In a condition of delayed feedback, the young adults are showing a very classic N170 response. So what is this telling us? When we delay feedback, the processing shifts. And so this is expected, but we see that the processing shifts from these more kind of anterior cingulate reward mediated reward prediction mechanisms to medial temporal lobe, potentially kind of explicit mechanisms. Now in older adults, what's happening? So in older adults, remember, they had reduced learning under immediate feedback conditions and equivalent learning under delayed feedback condition. So when we look at their FRN, which is what we would expect to see in the immediate feedback condition, we see an altered FRN. So they're not showing the expected valence effect of this really nice FRN. We would expect to see a nice peak here with a valence effect of negative relative to positive, and we're not seeing it. So in their condition, that immediate feedback, they're not learning and they're not processing the feedback effectively. When we look at their N170, we see a nice classic N170. So when the feedback is delayed, they process the feedback in a manner that parallels the young adults, and they also learn in a manner that parallels the young adults. So the take home here is that one, feedback timing is leading to distinct neurophysiological processing of feedback, potentially moving from these frontostriatal circuits towards the MTL. And older adults might have difficulty with this. So the older adults are having difficulty, particularly with the immediate feedback, and this is probably relevant for aphasia. So the idea is to look at this in people with aphasia and start thinking about feedback, since feedback is a huge part of therapies and interventions. So shifting gear a little, another way that we're looking at learning and manipulating context is through artificial grammar learning. So we've just collected data on an AGL study. And artificial grammars, I put this schematic, we're using an artificial grammar expressed in non-linguistic form. So it's these shapes, and we're having patients learn patterns of shapes. And as many of people are probably familiar, artificial grammars are leveraged quite a bit in language research because they're thought to contain these structural hierarchies and dependencies that parallel the dependencies that we have in natural language. So we might say the dog, we can also say the cat, the house. The can be followed by many things, but certain nouns are always going to be preceded by an article, etc. So certain things are violations, but others are not, and there's flexibility in the kind of route. So there have been studies that have looked at AGL learning in aphasia, and specifically they've looked at profiles of agrammatic aphasia. Why? Because this hierarchical dependency is thought to kind of parallel syntactic processing. And so we tend to look at people who have deficits in syntactic processing with the question of, can they learn these AGL tasks? So we kind of replicated a classic observational AGL task. We know that syntactic learning is often carried out implicitly or observationally. So this is the most classic. It's kind of a classic implicit AGL task. So we had a match task where they would see one sequence and then they would see another sequence. And this is the exposure phase. They're seeing only grammatical sequences, but they're told, does it match or doesn't match? This was to increase the attention and make sure that they were looking at all of the sequences. It also kind of masks that they're learning a grammar. So we ended up having to drop, I think, one person who had low accuracy on this task. Otherwise, people were performing quite well on this match task. And so they do many, many trials. And then we move on to a testing phase where we say, hey, those patterns followed rules. Now we're going to show you new sequences. And we want you to, they do training with 32 unique strings. Where they see 115 exposure trials. And then in this test phase, we show them unique strings and we say, now you're going to tell us if these seem to be grammatical or familiar, or if these seem like violations of the sequence, basically. We tell them that the sequences follow rules and they have to judge them. We presented each test item twice, and we compute what we refer to as a stringent accuracy score. So AGLs can be kind of tricky to get an accurate score. So what we do is you have to be correct on both presentations to be considered an accurate scoring of that. And that brings your chance level up down to 25%. So it's not a 50-50 chance, it's a 25% chance, because 2 times they have to say that's non-grammatical, or 2 times they have to say that's grammatical. We also had a cognitive linguistic battery. So we were curious to see which aspects of their language profile might relate to their performance on this AGL task. So we look at aphasia severity through the Western aphasia battery. We also looked quite a bit at their grammatical processing. So remember, many of these studies have been done in agrammatic or affluent, non-fluent people with aphasia. So we wanted to have a score of their grammaticality. We also wanted to look at verbal short-term memory, verbal working memory, visual attention, and executive functions. Good. So this study, we had 14 people, and I've organized them, I'm going to highlight here, based on their SCT score. So this is the sentence comprehension test, which is a subtest from the Northwestern Assessment of Verbs and Sentences that ultimately kind of captures the deficits in syntactic processing. So the lowest scores, the people in the low numbers, have lower scores of grammatical processing relative to those here in the higher numbers who have higher scores, suggesting that more complex syntactic forms aren't more difficult for them to understand compared to this other group where when you increase the complexity of the syntax, their comprehension goes down. And they're pretty closely aligned on the production test as well. But so I've already organized them based on their kind of score of grammaticality. When we look at their observational stringent accuracy, so remember 25% is chance, so it's a little small. People are above chance on average, so the mean is above chance. People were able to learn at the group level, but with clinical studies, it's always interesting to see what they do at the individual level. And what you see here is that most people were able to get above chance. This cluster down here is pretty close to chance performance. And remember, these were the ones with the most, with the lowest scores of syntactic processing. Yeah, and we see kind of a big picture arc where they're increasing. So as grammatical processing increases, their scores on this observational AGL also increases, suggesting perhaps that there is a parallel between this artificial grammar learning task and their language grammatical processing. And we saw this when we ran a correlation matrix. We do see that their observation learning scores correlate with their aphasia quotient, so severity plays a role, And we also see that their grammaticality scores are correlating with their performance on this task. So it's interesting to see that some aspects of language are correlating with this performance on this very non-language task. And then the verbal working memory composite also correlated. So what about a different method of instruction? This is what I get most excited about. And this is where we develop a completely novel task, well, completely novel. We took an artificial grammar again. So similar, we have slightly different shapes and we have a slightly different sequence. This time in the computerized training phase, we taught them the rules one at a time. If you've worked with people with aphasia, this feels very, very hard. It's fascinating to watch people do this, but we brought them to achieve the task. Basically, they learned one rule at a time, and I'll walk you through that. It was feedback-based learning, and they were advanced based on performance. So after we exposed them to one rule, we then asked them, is this allowed? Is this allowed? Is this allowed? They had to get 65% accuracy applying the rule they had just learned to go on. If they didn't, they did that rule training again for that rule, up to 3 rule repetitions. If they couldn't do it at 3, we called it quits and we went straight to test. So this would be an example of a rule-based instruction. And we always had, so somebody would be saying this, there was a recording and they would see it. So we would introduce the rule, rule 1, the sequence must begin with circle or pentagon. And then we ask them, can a sequence begin with this shape? If they get it right, that's right. A sequence can begin with circle or pentagon. Is this allowed? That's not right. A sequence can only begin with circle or pentagon. So what seems highly inachievable at first, they hear it over and over and over and over again. And we really reinforce that. Once they have that feedback-based learning, which is kind of what I just modeled, they then would go to a probe where they get no feedback, but we compute on the back end whether they're correct or incorrect. Make sense? Super. And there are 5 rules maximum. And then exactly like the observational task in the testing phase, they see 32 unique strings. They have grammatical items and non-grammatical items. Again, we compute this stringent accuracy. So when we look at the scores there, they're actually quite good. So our group, which was a little bit more on the mild side, learned pretty well. They have pretty high accuracy. And if we compare it to the observational learning task, it's actually a higher accuracy. When we can reason, we're really good at applying our reasoning. And we see that in the people with aphasia. When we broke down their accuracy by rule, so remember they learned 5 rules. And what you see here is their accuracy applying rule 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we see evidence of a primacy and a recency effect. So the first rule you learn sticks with you and the most recent. And we see that quite a bit in studies. Now the individual level. So at the individual level, these are ordered in the same order as previously. And what you see is a range of learning abilities. I wanted to highlight though 4 people who, while their scores are pretty high, except for this one who just bombed it, was unable, had to withdraw from the task due to frustration. So that's why we still have a bar there. It was frustrating for them. These participants were able to ultimately learn, but they had to go through multiple learning cycles. So these are the ones where we had to go back and reinforce some of the rules. Once they had the reinforcement of rules, though, they did pretty well, which I think is an interesting lesson because going into this, we thought that maybe people with aphasia, a subset, would really bomb this task. Again, we have to try very severe patients, but if you scaffold them and support them, and I think we know this through therapy, many of them are quite capable of learning complex rules and applying them, and we see that in this group. But I'm always interested in looking at a learning profile. And so here I've put the observational scores next to the rule-based scores. And we see that there are a few people who seem to really have a differential. So I've highlighted those people who have one task over another that is better. And the longer term question is, okay, if we took these people and enrolled them in a therapy that was more observational in nature or rule-based in nature, would this predict who benefits from which one? There are many people who fall in the middle, and many people, probably like all of us in this room, can learn via either mechanism. There's probably a subset of our people with aphasia who can learn from one mechanism more so than the other, potentially. So TBD with some treatment work. When we looked at a relationship with our cognitive linguistic variables, here we don't see any correlations with our composite measures, nor our composite measures are somewhat limited and it's a smaller sample. But this also might tap into this idea that we had an adaptive instructional protocol. So some people repeated the instruction and other people didn't. And here we're correlating based on their test accuracy. So I think that's partially why we're not seeing any clean relationships to kind of predict. Okay. So I thought I would now changing to applying this to therapy, because this is really the goal. And we kind of talked in our discussion earlier about keeping things clinically relevant. So the last study that I want to share with you was led by Victoria Tilden-Balowski, who's now an assistant professor over at Teachers College at Columbia. And she did a study called Incorporating Metacognitive Strategy Training into Semantic Treatment. So this is what we've been aiming for here, is pulling this into the therapy environment. So SFA, most of you are probably familiar with. This is semantic feature analysis that is often used to stimulate the language system, where a person is presented with a target picture, and then we walk through feature activation. So you have them talk about what something is, how do you use it, what does it do, what are some of its properties, where do you find it, what does it make you think of? The challenge in the SFA world is that there's limited generalization to untrained items. Very reliably, people show improved lexical retrieval for trained items, as well as untrained within category items, where you get spreading feature activation, but we don't really see generalization to untrained items outside of the category. And the assumption in SFA studies is that people with aphasia are learning this framework, that they're internalizing this through the process of therapy. But what all of the work in learning that I've done shows us that people aren't learning as naturally and quickly as we think they are. So the question here was to ask, maybe explicit training of the framework and strategies are really necessary to incorporate into therapy at the expense of trial repetitions. So what I mean there is, in therapy, in this trial, we're spending a lot more time talking about the framework, the meta piece, and we're having less time repeating items. With the idea that hopefully when these individuals are in their real world environment, the goal in SFA is that kind of this is popping into their heads and it's helping them to improve their lexical access and retrieval, but we weren't sure that people were doing that. So Victoria ran 4 people in this treatment study. If we look at their aphasia severity, we actually nicely have kind of a cluster in the lower range with Broca's aphasia and 2 in the higher range with anomia. And she enrolled them in pre-treatment. We had a set of cognitive linguistic assessments and 3 pre-treatment naming probes. She then enrolled them in treatment for 8 weeks, done 3 times a week over Zoom. And then there's a post-treatment where we repeat the testing and then we look at retention of their naming. So what was different about the therapy was that there was strategy education. So every session first started with what word finding is, describing it, how to recognize it, is the word coming or is it not? And then really talking to them explicitly about how circumlocution could be helpful for them to find the words, as well as for their listener to guess what they were getting at, and talking about the framework. And then they would, for each item, the first question was, is the word coming or not? So we're improving their kind of self-awareness of whether it's coming or not. And then they worked on generating features independently. And then this process of really aligning, okay, this is a feature. Is this something is this like something I use it for, or does this describe what it looks like, to really enhance and reinforce that framework? And then there was a strategy debrief afterwards, which first was to reflect on the session. And then most importantly, think about a real life scenario where they could use the strategy. So just building some metacognitive awareness about why are we doing this and how is this important for you? So do people with aphasia acquire knowledge of the framework? These data here are looking at, you'll see it's a scale, it's a little small, but this is a scale of 6. Essentially, this is talking about those 6 different feature categories. And patients could express those to us in any way that they wanted to. But look at this. The assumption is that they're internalizing it. They had explicit instruction. And what you see is that some of them get there. It takes them, though, 4 weeks. We're probing once a week. Some of them are never able to express all 6. So that right there helps us support in this small sample. Maybe they're not internalizing the framework because these guys, when they're getting explicit training on it, don't always consistently report on the framework. And then when we're looking at naming, Victoria was interested in looking at correct items spontaneously. So we're going to break up, whoopsies, we're going to do a little color scheme here. So first, there's correct spontaneously. So I'll just go ahead and show you what are. So when you're looking at the blue, these are accuracy when it's correct spontaneously, meaning I see an apple, I name an apple. The teal is correct after verbalization or circumlocution. So one idea is that when people generate these features, they actually self-cue and it improves their own lexical access. So we're curious to see if they're producing more verbalizations. The gray is incorrect, but with verbalizations. So this suggests that a person is talking around the item, but they ultimately still get it wrong. And the yellow is incorrect with no verbalization. The yellow to us is just the dead zone, right? They're not giving us anything. And what you'll see in this person, for example, these are the pre-treatment naming probes. These are the post. And what we really hope to see with this treatment that we see is the yellow disappears. She's spending a lot of time helping them increase the gray and increase the teal. And so that was exciting when we look first at two people who had pretty accurate naming at baseline. What you can still see is we see that yellow disappear and we see an increase in the teal and the gray. So when they don't know, they're giving us something. And they are also improving a little bit in their spontaneous accuracy. And then even more dramatic, and I think is most exciting and where we're kind of focused, are those lower level patients, where if you were to look only at the blue, which is what most studies are looking at, they're really not making many gains, especially this first person here, P63. But when you look at the teal and the gray, there's a huge change. And we're in the process now of quantifying what they were saying in that moment. But there are studies that have looked at verbalizations prior to a production in anomia studies, and this helps your communicative partner. And so it's exciting to see that there was a large change in the number of gray, the amount of verbalizations produced, even in people who weren't necessarily showing huge gains or measurable gains on their actual naming. So from this study, the take home is, while we might think this is what's happening naturally with patients in our studies, it's more like this. And then we have really talked a lot about focusing on the gray, because even through the course of therapy, and as we know, people with aphasia get so hung up when they're wrong, they get really stuck in this blue. Our assessments are stuck in this blue. This is where we're scoring. But as we think of functional communication, maybe really getting this gray is all we need and what we should encourage and what we should work on with our patients. So some take homes are that we do see maybe some variability in terms of profile. Also, though, we are reasoning, language-driven humans who like to use explicit processing. So maybe when we can do it, we should leverage it. And then thinking about when we are in our therapy sessions, there probably is a lot more time that we should dedicate to why are we doing this? How can you do this yourself? How are you going to use it? Because we do a lot of repetition and we assume that they're internalizing across a variety of therapies. They probably need a lot more instruction and meta awareness and training on that. And finally, let's focus on the gray because maybe we can shift the focus from just accurate naming, but thinking about communication as this kind of joint process to improve their verbalizations. So I wanted to thank the many people who contributed to this work, and I think I have time for questions.
People online, feel free to either unmute yourself or post your questions on chat.
And then we have a question in the room. Yeah.
Thank you. This was awesome.
Okay.
The sort of question that I had, you talked a lot about feedback processing. From an aphasia perspective, do you think like adding a reward aspect to the model would be beneficial?
Yeah. So the question was, I talked a lot about feedback processing. Would reward add a lot to the picture? Absolutely. we're still trying to figure that out. You know, I think reward, our word is motivation
Mhm.
that we leverage
Yeah.
quite a bit. So in the RTSS, they talk about motivation. They use the word volition.
Mhm.
There is work that's acknowledged that people need to be motivated
Mhm.
for the target.
Right.
Do we yet have a way to truly identify and capture how motivated somebody is? Not completely.
Yeah. Right.
So there are many studies that will try to kind of tailor lists based on somebody's interests, but it's an area that we need to work on
Yeah.
a little bit more. Yeah,
Like sort
for
of
sure.
like using like a reinforcement learning
Yes,
framework with a
absolutely.
feedback and a reward model.
Definitely, definitely. We're doing a piece. So I have a thesis student now who's doing a different version of kind of an SFA
Mhm.
where she's pulling in additional work from the behavioral change world. And there's a part where you talk to them about kind of buying into the process, which is sort of a way to motivate. There's also kind of collaborative goal setting, which is another way to bring in the motivation piece. It's definitely a big piece. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
This is sort of more qualitative maybe in
Mhm.
nature, but I'm curious your thoughts sort of about like rapport with a clinician. Like
Mhm.
I think about that all the time in terms of like when you, for research especially, like first session, you're assessing them and then we're looking at outcome measures, but it's also they've spent 20 weeks with a clinician. And so is sort of some of that co-founded, they get more comfortable, maybe they're more comfortable making errors, and so that sort of plays into it as well.
For sure. So some of those things we can't
Less
avoid.
anxiety.
Yes,
Yeah.
less anxiety for sure. So Marissa and I had been talking about this several years ago and did some work even looking at a risk profile and thinking about personality and risk aversion for very much this idea. And Laura Kahana-Mite has done some really interesting work in this area, thinking about stress and linguistic anxiety. So the idea that many people, we all have a linguistic anxiety, and it can actually create disfluencies in normal speakers, typical speakers. And so if we think about it in the context of aphasia, where someone is always making errors or prone to make errors, they have that self-regulation. So we were thinking about this, and there's some preliminary data that we have to publish someday, thinking about somebody's own aversion, because some of us are willing to take the risk and jump out there and are more likely to just try. And some of us are going to be more risk averse, and that's going to kind of contribute to self-monitoring and hesitation. And it's true with our patients, just give me something. We have so many patients who just, they don't say anything, but you gotta give me something. So for sure. Then interestingly, what you asked made me think of a study that Carla Tierney Hendricks in my lab recently did, where she was looking at engagement. And she actually went to see people in the acute phases. So she would go see them over at Spalding, so in the subacute. And she carried out a qualitative study to get them to say, what is engaging for you in therapy? And she finds that engagement varied based on different people and their models of engagement. Some is the person, some is like, I like this girl who comes in at 4, she motivates me to do well. Some people are really outcome driven. Some people are just like effort, frustration, self-monitoring. So there are models of engagement out there that show us that different people are motivated by different factors. It's another one of those areas where we have so much more work to do, but 100%, I think it absolutely plays a role in how functionally people leverage strategies, are engaged in therapy, and are willing to take risks in their own strategies. I mean, we have people who pull out their phone. They have 3 words, but they're super functional because they leverage all of these modalities. That's taking risks. That's being willing to make errors. Yeah, lots of interesting ideas there. Yeah.
I absolutely love this work. I think this is so clinically relevant and helpful for, thinking about principles of neuroplasticity and salience and how we can sort of make therapy more meaningful to sort of induce change. I just think this is amazing. I was wondering if in terms of the last study, if you looked at maybe confidence scores like CCRSA, because even though their accuracy might not be improving, maybe they feel more confident in their ability to navigate community.
Yes. So Victoria's on here. We did collect the CCRSA. I'm trying to remember what they reported on that. I will say she gave the metacognitive assessment of language, which has some really interesting questions that ask about how a person is using their language. There, anecdotally, people showed a big change. Notably, there was a caregiver who talked about their person with aphasia who would finally actually answer the phone. Before, they didn't want to make any phone calls, but after this study, they were willing to get on the phone because they would say something. The confidence is sometimes tricky. Sometimes as we improve, our confidence then kind of changes. So I'll have to check in on the CCRSA scores, but we do administer that one. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for wonderful talk. And I found your work on artificial grammar learning piece for people with aphasia very interesting. So in a way, like from more like a theoretical perspectives, there is huge debate between implicit and explicit cognitive mechanisms that subserves that, some group of people argue that, like implicit grammar learning, like such as artificial grammar learning is not related to the controlled processing, such as working memory. But I think it's surprising that, people with aphasia were able to process this artificial and very abstract grammar learning. So my question is that what is the cognitive mechanism that makes that happen? And whether, it's, for normal brain, it's implicit. May not be related to working memory or control processing, but do you think that people with aphasia recruited more like controlled processing to make that happen?
That's a good question. So the question was talking about how there is this debate about implicit and explicit and whether the people with aphasia recruited controlled processing. I honestly think it varies. When you look at the individual results and when you watch people do this, I think that it's variable. I think some of them don't know what's happening and it's their implicit processing. They're fighting it so often, and we see this a lot in literature too. When you try to apply explicit processing and reasoning, it actually disrupts some of this natural pattern recognition that we have. And so I think that in some instances, it's the pattern recognition that kind of takes over and it's truly implicit processing. I think that's the most successful way to learn the observational task, for example, but I think some are looking at chunks. So we have some chunk strength analyses. So often in artificial grammars, you can look at the chunk strength. So what that means is you look at how often triads and dyads show up together and you look at the score. Actually, I might have those as backup slides. Do I have those? Yeah, so when we look at the chunk strength, so if I'm looking at, this is grammatical endorsement. So we look at the endorsement rate based on grammaticality. And if it's implicit, we would expect to see this pattern on the left. The chunk strength is thought to be driven by more explicit reasoning. So when people are memorizing kind of sub-triads, we expect high chunk strength to be kind of more grammatically endorsed than not. So in our sample, we do see evidence that they might be recruiting that implicit processing. In the work I did in Swathi's lab, we saw a really interesting pattern where it was kind of an implicit task as well. Do you know of this? And we saw that the people with the best language and the worst language learned it best. And the people in the middle are the ones who bombed the test. And that has always stuck with me. And what I believe happens in that case is when you have access to language, you use it. And if it's good enough language, it's going to help you or it's not going to disrupt the implicit processing. When you have language, but it's imperfect, it muddles and it messes up the signal for the implicit side as well as the explicit. And then when your language is so impaired, you just allow that abstract pattern recognition mechanism to support you and you learn it. The case of aphasia and language is interesting in that the syntactic processing and the language piece is added on top of that. But I think we see some people with aphasia who are really capable of that implicit learning. And then I see some where they fight it. And in a typical brain, I think the dominant brain system or whichever brain system is best tailored for the task will take over and win. And I think that's what gets kind of garbled in aphasia sometimes. Yeah.
That's a very nice explanation, and it's applicable for treatment approaches as well.
Definitely. We can get them to get out of their own way sometimes, but it's hard to figure out how to do that. And the rule-based task was interesting to watch though too, because I think many people surprised us. So there were also quite a few people who were capable of learning complex rules and holding them in working memory to apply to the testing phase. And I will say it was surprising to me. Who knows how that would bear out over a longer treatment session and over time, but that was an interesting kind of lesson to observe too. Yeah. Yes, there's
I will say, very nice, thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I know it's almost 5, but I'm just like still stumped by that delayed feedback helping.
Oh,
build
yeah.
and control. Like,
I know.
What,
Mhm.
what does that mean for aphasia? Like,
Yeah, this is a great question. I think so. What I would love to do for the delayed feedback is probe feedback that's like 1,500 milliseconds later. Because well, who knows if we even want all these slides. Because if you look at brain structures, the implicit system is supposed to be better preserved with aging. So when you look at the aging literature, it's the declarative memory system that tanks first. And so we're thought to be able to recruit the implicit learning system. So we were bummed to see that and thought, wait a minute, this doesn't really align. Because that implicit reward mediated feedback learning is supposed to be more robust to aging. I think what we do see pretty reliably in aphasia and probably in older adults is there's more time, that processing time.
Yeah.
So I do think that if we were to manipulate, and maybe in the future we need to do this, 500 milliseconds, that was too fast.
Mhm.
It's just too quick. And so they just whoosh. It
Yeah.
didn't even have an opportunity to have that reward processing. Maybe it's 800 milliseconds, maybe it's 1,000, but it's probably a balance before you toggle into a
I
different
was just
system.
gonna say, I don't
Yeah.
even think it's about, I don't
Yeah.
think it's about them understanding the reward. It's the fact that it actually takes them that long to process the
I
information.
think it does. And these are healthy
Yeah.
older adults.
Yeah, but
So
if you,
what's
like,
going
if you
on
think
with
about your
aphasia?
parent, you say something to them.
Yeah,
But what now? Like, it takes them that much
for
time.
sure.
And that's
Yeah.
really interesting, because that's something you have to think about
Mhm.
in aphasia then, as your patients
Definitely.
get older.
And in Alzheimer's, I mean, you all are doing a lot more work in dementia and Alzheimer's. And so we know that the dementia is affecting medial temporal lobe structures more. And so we know those declarative systems are more susceptible. Again, though, we get to this reasoning piece. So we have the first, and I think is probably the idea, is that it's too fast and you have to find that optimal window. But then there's this notion, if we sit back, right, as we're older, we're wiser and we reason and we rely on that reasoning. So there's also perhaps some piece of the
So
decision
maybe it's
making.
gone. If it's too long, it's gone too.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, because
Mhm.
when you were asking us, I couldn't even remember what was on the
Yes.
previous slide. So there's this fine balance.
There is a fine
there.
balance,
I
exactly.
was wondering if you showed the feedback on the slide with the
Yes.
animals, would you see differing
We
results?
probably
So
would,
that would be
yeah.
more controlled, because it's like, oh, yes, that
Right.
your brain
Yes.
goes through that process.
Yep.
Yeah.
There for the clean EEG signal, you want to kind of dissociate it, and also so that you can truly isolate that feedback. But you're right, in the real context, we're typically showing them. This is an interesting task also in that there are multiple features. So feedback is somewhat informative. It's not completely informative.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
this is what we find also. We did do a study in people with aphasia, looking at the feedback processing for this task. And the way people use feedback in this task in particular is complicated because there's so many features and it's not necessarily informative feedback, right? So if you know you're wrong, you don't know why automatically. And so perhaps on this time scale, a task where it's a more simple, incorrect, boom, it's the other one. I know exactly what that means. Maybe they could process that. In this case, it was a more holistic, but part of that task is that it is a task that is best learned implicitly. You actually learn those probabilistic associations, and it's best learned through getting this overall impression, then trying to rationalize it and do this rule based. So you have to find that right balance. Yeah. There's also talk, when you look into the feedback literature, they talk also about bundling feedback or giving feedback every 4 trials. There's so much in the world of feedback processing that makes such a huge impact on the potential learning. There's a lot of work to be done there. And motivation too. Some people say it's demoralizing, but in some cases it's effortful and successful. So that we've done too is to try to capture which type of learning people prefer, and then look at if that's well aligned or misaligned with how they learn best. Because there might be a piece that's, you don't like this, you're gonna suffer, but you know what? You're gonna learn it, you're gonna remember it in 3 weeks. Whereas if I don't make you suffer, you're gonna forget it the minute you walk out of this room. Saying that makes it feel better to take that negative feedback, makes you more motivated, not so demoralized. So there's a lot to picture, yeah.
On that note. Please let these guys go.
Yeah.
They have a happy hour to go.
Um,
So do we.
Mhm.
Fantastic.
Thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.
much.
Sorry, I just have one last
Yeah.
question. These are just like single electrodes?
Yes, so we look at, so we collect whole brain data and then we do an analysis to ensure, we suspect that the signal will be the strongest at certain electrodes and to ensure that that's the strongest signal. So for the FRN, it's really the central and then the N170 we definitely do it. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, everyone online.
Thanks. I'm gonna, I'll tell her after.
Yeah, 'cause I declared, so much for my master.